Good afternoon. Thank you for zooming in for this important conversation on the history of child-family separation during slavery in the United States and the role of the Catholic Church in that history. Before we begin, let's make sure everyone can access interpretation if they need it. There is a globe at the bottom of your screen, and you may choose to listen to this conversation in English, French, or Spanish. My name is Gillian Hubner, and I lead the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. It's an honor to welcome you today for a conversation jointly convened with the Georgetown Center for the Study of Slavery and its Legacies, Catholic Relief Services, and Changing the Way We Care. This is the third webinar in a series. It's part of the Faith and the Family Forum, which focuses on the role of the Catholic Church in separating children from families in a variety of historical and regional contexts: American slavery, Native American boarding schools, and the development and use of residential care or orphanages worldwide. The forum also considers the important role of the Catholic Church in preventing child-family separation and supporting vulnerable children, families, and communities in other contexts, including in migration policy and response. During this webinar, participants will explore the role of the Catholic Church in separating children from families during slavery in the United States. Given the broad historic and geographic scope of this topic, this conversation will hit particularly close to home. In 1838, a group of America's most prominent Catholic priests, the Society of Jesuits, sold 272 enslaved people to save Georgetown University, their largest mission project, and the first Catholic institution of higher learning in the United States. The sale included the separation of children from parents, a common feature of the slave trade. In a recent article about the 1838 sale, Rachel Swarns shared how witnesses described the terrors of enslavement: children torn from their parents, brothers from their sisters, and desperate people forced to board slave ships that sailed to Louisiana. It was one of the largest documented slave sales of the time, and it shattered entire families. We have a lot to reckon with here. You're welcome to join the conversation through the Q&A chat box. And now I'm going to hand over to Adam Rothman, a professor in the Department of History and director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and its Legacies at Georgetown University. Adam served on Georgetown's Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation, and is currently the principal curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive. Adam, thank you for moderating this conversation and centering children in our remembering.
Gillian, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for coordinating this webinar and this whole series, in fact. I want to thank the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues, Catholic Relief Services, and Changing the Way We Care for lifting up this conversation. It's especially important, I think, for those of us here at Georgetown to be wrestling with these issues in a deep historical way, since our own university is so deeply tied to the history of slavery. I'll have a bit more to say about the historical context of the Atlantic slave trade, American slavery, child family separation, and human trafficking. But before we launch into the conversation, we'd like to begin with a clip from a performance by one of our panelists, Melisande Short-Coulomb. This is from her one-woman show, one woman presentation, Here I Am.
A Jesuit priest wrote in a letter about the sale of my heavenly grandmother, Harriet Queen, and her 7 children. Harriet's husband, James Queen, was a free man. We often hear about the Underground Railroad and the rigors of stealing away, but there were enslaved families in America, in Maryland and Virginia, who were using the court system to free themselves. James Queen's uncle, had been successful and achieved that in 1794. But Harriet Queen, his wife, was enslaved. Because of the laws of the land, her black body became the fertile ground upon which slavery continued. And her children, irrespective of who their fathers might be, because they came from the depths of her black womb and her body, her children were slaves for life. So there is a single statement, one sentence written by a priest in a letter that says, Harriet chose to go with her children.
Harriet chose to go with the children.
Harriet chose to go with her children. That's a hell of a decision. But what other decision is there? What woman would choose differently? And what kind of institution, what kind of people would present that choice as a viable one? When people talk about the morality of the Jesuits and their desire to make sure that the sanctity of marriage was honored and families were kept together even in the atrocity of slavery, I remember Harriet chose to go with her children. And I ask, what would she have done without the Jesuits in her life? Those 7 words ground me as a mother, as a daughter, as a descendant of this heavenly grandmother.
Melisande, what a powerful piece. I had the opportunity to see Melisande perform that in person in Gaston Hall at Georgetown University, and it's an incredibly powerful piece, and we will return to it over the course of this conversation and hear more from Melisande about the ideas animating that piece of art. But I want to start with some history. I want to start with some historical context that I think will help us understand and frame our conversation about child-family separation in the context of the Atlantic slave trade and American slavery. So let's start with this on the biggest scale possible, the Atlantic slave trade. Over the course of 400 years, it's estimated that as many as 12 million captive Africans were embarked from the shores of Africa to the Americas. And the best recent estimates by historians suggest that at least 1 in every 5 of those captive Africans was a child. We tend to neglect the presence of children in the Atlantic slave trade and American slavery more generally, in part because we think of American slavery or Atlantic slavery primarily as a labor system, and children don't quite fit into that. But of course, children grow up, if they survive, and become the laborers that feed the Atlantic slave system. So 1 in every 5 people trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean was an enslaved child. That's one piece. The second piece is something that Melisande alluded to in her performance, and that's the law that was true across the Americas in the era of slavery, that status followed the mother. So if you were born to an enslaved mother, you would also be enslaved. This is a rule known as partus sequitur ventrum. And it meant that children and reproduction was crucial to the development of Atlantic and American slavery. Keeping that law, that rule at the center of our attention also places children at the center of American slavery, particularly in the slave system that that gains a foothold in the United States, which relied more on reproduction than importation over time. So these two basic facts, the presence of children in the Atlantic slave trade and this rule of hereditary descent through the mother, are defining features of Atlantic and American slavery. And I want to start the conversation with our panelists reflecting on the presence and role of children in the broader Atlantic slave system. So maybe let's start with Melisande, since it's your piece that we heard at the beginning of our conversation. How does centering Harriet and her children and the choice that was forced on Harriet in the context of the slave sale in 1838, how does that shape the way we should think about American slavery?
Thank you, Adam. I think that centering American slavery in the 1838 sale was part of a long continuum in the United States going back to colonial times, when color became the identifier of another class of human being here that was subhuman, subservient, and set to labor. So here in Virginia, that grew and grew and grew as this became America. And for the Jesuits in particular, who began their relationship with enslavement and human trafficking in 1729 and established a long history and economic platform of enslavement and human trafficking that became the American enslavement and human trafficking system. This started at the very beginning of who we are as a country and the establishment of the white affirmative action government. So we are in a long continuum of oppressing and enslaving the children born from Black women's bodies. And that hasn't changed. You know, in 1994, Bill Clinton and Joe Biden and the Congress signed bills into law that would commit Black children to a life of incarceration, that the 13th Amendment said the only way you can be a slave in America is to be a criminal. So we live in the way that we were created. We say American system is broken, the government is broken. Absolutely not. It is functioning the way it was created.
Melissa, you, in a very short time, you took us on this incredible sweep of history from 1729 up until the 1990s, seeing an essential continuity in American history. That's a powerful idea. To go back to the beginning, you say, for instance, 1729, I think it's useful for viewers perhaps to take a look, for example, at the records of a slave ship called the Margaret that arrived in Annapolis in 1718. And at least some members of the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community might be able to trace their ancestors back to that ship. But we have at Georgetown the records of the sale of captives from the Margaret in Annapolis And it's quite remarkable because they're all listed. Well, the captives on board that vessel are listed not by name, but just as categories: men, women, girls, and boys. And about 1 in every 3 of those captives was a child. So children are there from the very inception of American slavery in early Maryland. I want to, and we can come back to the Margaret and to that early period. I want to turn now to Chris Kellerman, who's with the Society of Jesus as a director of justice and ecology for the North American Jesuits, and the author of a really remarkable book called All Oppression Must Cease, about the relationship between the Catholic Church and slavery. Chris, those Africans on board the Margaret entered into a world of Catholic slaveholding in Maryland. And I was hoping you could help us understand how, in the early era of Atlantic slavery and the slave trade, the Catholic Church came to understand its own role in the history of Atlantic slavery. How did it view the slave trade and enslavement?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you everybody for being here. The sad fact of church history is that chattel slavery was something that was practiced by and allowed by the church from very early on in its history. And that did not change until the late 19th century. And so we have Christian households with enslaved people in the New Testament era, in the early church era, into the medieval era, and all the way until the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And we have important Catholic theologians who defended it, who defended treating another person as chattel, as movable property. It was part of canon law, and it was part of church practice in a big way. In the 15th century, when Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal wanted to start expanding the Portuguese empire, specifically through trade in Africa, he also began conducting slave raids and began purchasing enslaved people in Africa. And the Pope at the time, Pope Nicholas V, basically gave him a stamp of approval. And in 2 documents, in 1452 and in 1455, Pope Nicholas V gave sweeping and really unprecedented permission to Portugal to basically steal the lands of any non-Christian African territories and countries, and to reduce their people to perpetual slavery. And in the second of those papal bulls, he actually mentions that some of these enslaved people, both purchased or simply kidnapped, have been taken back to Portugal and have been baptized and become Christian. And so he writes of it quite approvingly. And 3 more popes explicitly approved of these bulls and renewed them. And the church did not really withdraw that approval formally until the 19th century. So the tradition of Catholic slaveholding and of Catholic participation in the Atlantic slave trade was actually, the Georgetown slave sale was one little piece of a much broader system of injustice. And unfortunately, shamefully, I must say that as a member of the Society of Jesus, in my own research, I read a lot of defenses of the international slave trade that started from the Society of Jesus, these defenses in the late 16th century, where they made up these ways to participate in it, even though they recognized the injustices and they said that, and then still found ways to justify it. And so in a real way, the Society worldwide, the Society of Jesus worldwide, was at the forefront of defending this. And the Society of Jesus's main journal in Rome basically defended the Confederacy and slavery itself all the way until 1865. And so, both in terms of the Catholic Church and the Society of Jesus itself, this was a very long defense of this system.
Yeah, and Chris, it seems to me that the defense rests on two pillars. One is the idea that slavery is lawful,
right?
And the second is that it is a means of Christianization. It's a way of bringing non-Christian people into Christianity. Am I right in seeing those as the kind of doctrinal, theological underpinnings of the Catholic defense of slavery in the era of the slave trade?
Yeah, there were what I would say about that that idea of the legality is absolutely right. It was part of the tradition and it was part of canon law. The Christianization aspect came especially as people of using that as a defense, came especially as people started questioning it, because they said, yeah, but some of these people are just being kidnapped. Some of these people, not in the typical way that people were enslaved. Some of these, people are being put on these horrible ships. And we see in documents where some Catholic theologians say, well, yes, these terrible things are happening, but at least they're becoming Christian. And I should say too that there were other theologians, there were other priests, and there are Black Catholics that we have record of saying, well, if you really just wanted them Christianized, why don't you go be missionaries in Africa, right? And there wasn't a good answer for that, obviously. Yeah. And so that's where we see where some of these justifications are really meant to just justify something that people know is unjust, right? Just like the racist theories that are developed at this time in order to justify this as well.
Yeah. Yes, there's certainly an important historical lesson in what you just said in the value of listening to the voices of Black Catholics in the historical record who protested against the slave trade and slavery and offered a different view of how things should be. Adrian, you're the director of the Archdiocese of Baltimore's Office of Black Catholic Ministries. We're talking to a certain extent about the origins of Black Catholicism in what becomes the United States. So how do you see this this entangled history of the church and slavery in its early years from your perspective?
Thank you for having me. I find it important that we're still Catholic, given the fact that we were considered less than human and on par with animals to be bartered and traded and sold off. And I look to some of the Black Catholics on the road to sainthood today for strength. I look at Father Tolton, who was an escaped slave, and he crossed from Missouri to Illinois. He had to learn how to read and write. The Franciscans in Quincy thought they saw potential. No seminary would have him. So he was eventually sent to Rome. He had to learn how to read and write Italian and Latin. He learned African languages while he was in Rome, thinking that he would go to an African country. And Rome said, no, we're going to send you back to the United States. He had a hard life, but he's a pillar for the Black community because he overcame so much. I look at our person for canonization, Mother Mary Lang, who started the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who are still around today. And she, despite all of the things that happened to her, continued. She survived a cholera plague here in Baltimore. Her sisters are still around. And so I find strength in the fact that even though we were objectified and thought of as less than, it's not so much the people around us, but we believe in Jesus Christ. And that has been the strength through it all.
Thank you. That's a very powerful reflection, and I appreciate you calling attention to these other figures in the historical tradition. I want to ask you one more thing along these lines about the sources of strength for people of African descent in what becomes the United States, and faith in Catholic faith is clearly for many a powerful thing. I want to also ask you about family, since we're talking about child-family separation. What do you think building families meant for enslaved people in a place like Annapolis, Maryland, Baltimore in the era of slavery?
I think it was important for Black people have extended family. We make people our family because of the separation from back to slavery. So you have, maybe a family was separated, but the people who are left in the community become that family. And there were a lot of slaves after slavery ended that went looking for their families. So family is a big, important thing. And I'm reading Rachel Swarns' book now. We're going to have a luncheon with her on Friday. And it saddens me that families were separated, but it's happening today as well. Look at the people trying to cross the border. They send their children. They don't know what's going to happen to their children. So it's still happening today. And it's something that we have to reckon with. It's not Christian to separate families or treat people less than human.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection. You said something really interesting that I want to come back to a little bit later, and that's about the strategies, the practices that enslaved people and their descendants used to fight against family separation and to deal with its consequences. Because I think that's a really important part of the story. And perhaps the history of the GU 272 and their descendants can help us illuminate that a little bit more. So let's turn to that very specific history that means so much to those of us on this in this conversation, those of us at Georgetown, and many other people. I think the importance of the story of the GU 272 and the 1838 sale is really shown by by Rachel Swarns' book and the tremendous attention that Swarns' investigative journalism has gotten. It's a very meaningful and powerful story that is really a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. Now, for those in our audience who may not know the whole story, We've already touched on it a bit, but the Maryland Jesuits became big slave owners by the middle of the 1700s. They had several plantations across Maryland. By the early 19th century, things had started to change. They engaged in a long debate about what to do about their human property. And they concluded in 1838 by selling virtually the entire community that they owned. There are 272 people listed in the original Articles of Agreement that they signed. They sold those people to Louisiana. Now, there was a lot of debate among the Jesuits about this sale. And the Jesuit leadership in Rome allowed the sale to happen, but placed certain conditions on it. One of the conditions that they placed on the sale was that husbands and wives should not be separated. But if you look at the letter, and all of this is well documented, you can go to the Georgetown Slavery Archive website to look at it. In the very letter that stipulates that husbands and wives are not to be separated, there's a line that basically says parents are not to be separated from children either. But then that is crossed out as if somebody thought to include it, but then decided better of it. It's really an incredible document to look at. So I want to explore this 1838 sale and what it means, and specifically what it means for family separation with our panelists. And I want to start with Chris. Maybe Chris, can you help us understand why the Jesuits might have imposed this restriction on the separation of husbands and wives, but not parents from children?
Yeah, I actually printed off that line with the thing crossed out. He ended up writing, husbands and wives in no way must be separated. And at first it said parents and children too, which is like a very strong forbidding. And then he crossed it out. And then the next line says, nor I should say parents from children as much as is possible. And so there's this wiggle room that he leaves there. And that is, that's actually kind of based in Catholic canon law regarding slavery from the time, because as movable property, an enslaved person doesn't have rights, right? They have extremely limited rights. And there was a time in the medieval era where the Catholic Church said, well, look, the sacrament of marriage is something that falls under our jurisdiction, not the state's. Therefore, enslaved people should be able to marry who they want, and that should be under the purview of the church. Once that was part of that law, they then said, and that should also mean that, or that should also indicate that if a slaveholder decides to separate them in a sale, he's committing a mortal sin, because he's basically divorcing them, right? Which could then possibly lead to adultery, and it's breaking something that God has put together, right? Breaking these parents, this husband and wife. There was never anything about that regarding children, though, because there isn't that unbreakable sacramental bond between parents and children in Catholic theology, right? And so there's even in some of these earlier church councils at the local level that then becomes part of canon law, a ruling that if a member of the clergy was basically breaking his vow of celibacy and living with a woman, that if they had a child, that child was to become the property of the church, was to become a slave. And so there was, to some extent, family separation. There was child separation in canon law itself, right? And so what we have then in that document is a long tradition where the Superior General knows that the separation of parents, the separation of a wife and husband would be very morally wrong, but that the separation of children is something that is maybe frowned upon, but not illegal in Catholic law. And so, it's interesting because apparently the original intention of the Jesuits is to try to keep these families together, which is why they have these two big sales, right? They sell them to two planters. But then what happens? It's something that happens over and over and over in American slavery. The two planters don't have the financing for it. The bank sort of holds them as collateral. They aren't able to fund it, and then everybody's separated. Because this is what it meant to be chattel, that at the end of the day, your life could change in an instant, And so children absolutely were separated. Now, how could the Jesuits have prevented that? If they had simply manumitted all these people and freed them, right? That's how they could have prevented the child separation that ended up occurring.
Right. Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for that that explanation. There's a lot to think about there. Certainly on the level of law, but also there's law, and then there's what happens. Melissan, the clip that we saw from Here I Am, I think gets at the human experience of what that 1838 sale meant for the people who lived through it, and the complexities, the contradictions, the reality on the ground that was left by these decisions by the Jesuits. So just to review, so Harriet Queen, you called your heavenly grandmother?
Yeah.
So she was actually married to a free man, James Queen. The Jesuits own her and her children. They sell her children to Louisiana as part of this deal, and then she's forced to choose between her husband and her children. Can you explain that a little bit more, and what the reality on the ground of the sale might have been?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. The Queens were one of the premier families that had been giving the Jesuits the blues, right? The Queens and the Mahoneys. I'm a descendant of both of those families. Part of what happened with the sale is also laws in Louisiana that said children under the age of 10 years old cannot be sold to Louisiana without their mother, because they are incapable of caring for themselves. So in the 1838 sale, more than half of the people who are sold are under the age of 25, right? Some of them are infants, toddlers, in utero. The whole reason for the sale was because of the amazing capacity of Black Catholics to have Black Catholic families of many children, which over time became supernumeraries in the language, because all of these children were consumers and not creating a source of income. The option was to sell to free the families who had free community and family members all around them here in Maryland. There was land that could be sold here in Maryland, or you could do some sneaky dealing and betray the people who had been in community with the Jesuits for over 150 years as family groups. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, the Catholic Church were enslavers and human traffickers. Right up until 1865, and they behaved in that way. My 3 times great-grandparents, Mary Ellen Queen, Abraham Mahoney, 16 and 17 years old, transported with 51 members of their family in June of 1838, met on the boat to Louisiana and became families. Those families were not actually separated, like talking about it, because the purchasers and the Jesuits, they still had a mortgage. So for 25 years, the Jesuits received payments in the rear for the people who were sold. You can't sell what you don't own. So essentially, the Jesuits still held the mortgage on many of those people who managed to survive the rigors of human trafficking, enslavement in Maryland, human trafficking, and then enslavement in Louisiana. Do you know how many people were alive at the end of the Civil War from the 314 people who were sold? Not quite 100.
Melissa, so many things occur to me in what you say. One is that the children who are part of the 1838 sale,
they were the reason for the sale.
The reason for the sale. I mean, they are both their property, their labor, their kind of embodied capital, and they also serve as collateral for the loan that financed the sale. So just even from a financial perspective, children are really a pivotal part of that moment, which is quite remarkable. The other thing that you mentioned, I mean, there are a number of things you mentioned. Another one is just the question of what constitutes who counts as a child and what counts as a family. Because that Louisiana law that you mentioned said children under the age of 10 can't be sold apart from their mothers. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that according to that law, childhood ends at the age of 10.
Right.
It also means that a family is a child under the age of 10 and their mother.
Right.
The fathers are completely excluded from all of this. And that reminds me of the story you tell about James Queen, who as a free man has no right to his own children.
Family.
Yeah.
Because the Society of Jesus owned the woman who was his wife, and every child born to women, Black women in America, were pretty much enslaved. And by 1859, the laws in America, and the Jesuits were still being paid and building colleges and universities and education platforms in 1859. They were really getting a foothold on education in America. The Fugitive Slave Act and Dred Scott said every Black child born in America could be put into enslavement by any white person. And the Jesuits wholly supported that.
Adrian, I want to turn to you because this also is a story of Black Catholicism in Maryland. We often focus on the GU-272 community that was sold down the river to Louisiana. But people stayed behind as well. A lot of Black Catholics remained behind in Maryland. Maryland was one of the hearths of Black Catholicism in the United States, along with Louisiana. And one of the interesting things about the 1838 sale is the way it connects those two poles of Black Catholicism in the United States, Maryland and Louisiana. I wonder if you could talk about how Black folk in Maryland, in the Upper South, dealt with this ever-present prospect of being sold and of having their children, parents having their children sold away from them, children having their parents sold away from them. And just another number to throw out here, the Oceans of Kinfolk Project has found that about 3 in every 10 captives sold or trafficked through the coastwise slave trade from the Upper South to the Deep South were children. So here again, children were a big part of the domestic slave trade. So what does that mean for folks in the Upper South, for folks in Maryland who are living in the shadow of that threat?
Fortunately, here in Maryland, Harriet Tubman was here. And so she led people out of the South. She made numerous trips back and forth through the Underground Railroad. And I had to explain that to an African priest who thought it was a real railroad once. I found it humorous, and I said, you really need to read up about Black people and stop with the misconceptions. But it's important that I think the people here in Maryland, because it wasn't the Deep South, they thought more about escaping. And so they left through the Underground Railroad. I just found an article yesterday. There was a path to Canada through the city of Chicago, my hometown. So I think people, they were in fear that their children would be taken away. And so they made plans to leave as much as they could. The Archdiocese of Baltimore is the first diocese in the United States. So we played a big role in slavery here in this part of the United States. And some of the priests who were part of the Archdiocese spread slavery to the West. So especially the Sulpicians religious group, they spread slavery. The nuns, some of the nuns that served here in Baltimore had slaves. I find it very ironic that one of the presidents of Georgetown, Healy, his mother was Black, his father was white. He could pass for white. He and his brothers passed for white, and they were around during the time of Father Tolton. And he became the president of Georgetown when Georgetown would not allow Black people in the school. So I find that ironic.
Yeah.
So we dealt with things the best we could, and we persevered through it all.
Adam,
Melissa, go ahead.
I'd like to say too, the 1838 sale, while there were stipulations about keeping families together and, Catholic rules, the purchasers of these Black Catholic enslaved families were Episcopalian. So there is enslavement and religion, while theoretically incongruent, were the lifeblood of building America. And you can't take any religious group out of the practice of enslavement and human trafficking in America if they were here in America. The Quakers, the Baptists, you know, maybe not so much the Methodists, but you could be a Quaker or Baptist or Methodist, not Baptist. You could have a religion in the North or in the Upper South and go to the Lower South and become an enslaver and a human trafficker. So irrespective of religion, the bottom line was economics.
Yeah, there's a deep lesson here in how economic interest shapes people's moral, can distort, can deform people's moral perspectives. And I think that's one of the fundamental lessons of the history of American slavery. And it is not just the Catholics, of course. I mean, many Protestant denominations in the United States had fierce battles over the whether or not slavery was a Christian institution. Churches split. And in many ways, one could argue that the American Civil War was a religious war over slavery, a war between two, as Lincoln says, both read the same Bible, but they drew different conclusions from it. I think that's quite sobering for anybody who wants to thinks that any religious tradition leads to any particular obvious conclusions.
The burning of crosses by the Ku Klux Klan, while that was interpreted as aggression for those men, that was connecting to their Jesus.
Yeah. Adrian mentioned that some of the priests in Maryland helped spread slavery into the West, including Missouri. And before we conclude our part of our conversation, before the Q&A, I want to introduce a letter that was written by a Black soldier in Missouri during the Civil War, a man named Spotswood Rice. And he writes to his children, telling them that he's going to rescue them from bondage, that they're held by a woman named Kitty Diggs. It's a remarkable letter. And part of it, he says, he writes to his children, so their owner is named Kitty Diggs. He says, "Your Miss Kitty said that I tried to steal you, but I'll let her know that God never intended for man to steal his own flesh and blood." And then he goes on to say, "I once thought that I had some respect for them," meaning slaveholders, "but now my respect is worn out and I have no sympathy for slaveholders. And as for her Christianity, I expect the devil has such in hell." That was Spotswood Rice writing in Missouri in 1864. And it speaks to something, Adrian, that you mentioned earlier, which is, and I think Harriet Tubman shows as well, that Black people fought to reunite their families. And that is also an important part of this history, right? So before we turn to Q&A, all of you have made connections between the past and the present in the course of our conversation, but I want to dig into that just a little bit more and ask you what the value is of dredging up this history. Why is it important to think through the history of child-family separation in the context of slavery? What does that matter for us today? And Adrian, I think I'd like to start with you because you've been involved in the Archdiocese of Baltimore's own investigation of its history of slavery.
Well, I think it's important because racism, slavery is an affront to the core principle of Catholic social teaching, life and dignity of the human person. Anything that is against that is a sin. And the church says that. It's not Adrian saying it from my office. The church says that. And so we have to deal with it. And so in March, we launched our Commission on Slavery. It has 17 members, including historians, researchers, clergy, educators, parishioners, and experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our goal is to research and document the ties to slavery in America's first Catholic diocese, acknowledge the harm to generations of Black people, and discern the steps the Archdiocese can take to address and repair that injury. The way things are in Baltimore is a result of how Black people have been treated across time. The commission is the latest step in the Archdiocese's journey to racial justice. It stems from 2 documents that Archbishop Laurie wrote. The first one in 2018, The Enduring Power of Dr. King's Principles of Nonviolence, and the second one in 2019, The Journey to Racial Justice, Repentance, Healing, and Action. So we've been working on this this year, and we're trying to do as much research as we can. We want to interview parishioners of families and just absorb as much as we can. We're going to have a gathering with Rachel Swarns coming up. And so it's important that people are aware, not cast aside what has happened. It's not just the history of the Black Catholic community, it's the history of the United States, and we all have to be accountable.
Thanks, Adrian. I think that last point is so important. It's all of our history, and it's incumbent on all of us to study and absorb it. Chris, you wrote a whole book. You're a Jesuit. You wrote a whole book on the entanglement between slavery and the Catholic Church. What did you hope to accomplish writing that book? What do you think, again, looking at this history can help us today to repair, things that are broken? And I guess specifically, what does this history have to tell us about the possibility for hope and healing around child-family separation and trafficking today?
Sure. Yeah, as dark and painful as the history is, there's these moments of hope that jump through. One thing that I wanted to mention was my good friend, the historian Kelly Schmidt, writes about in her research how Black Catholics, in order to expand those sacramental bonds, would pick certain godparents for their children, and then get more and more of that web together, so that it would sort of play off of their Catholic masters' Catholicism to say, well, like, you can't separate me from my godchildren, right? So that's one of the ways that Black Catholics creatively saw their Catholicism as a way to bond them together, right? So these beautiful moments come through. And I think that those moments help us to sort of think about, what does it mean to be Catholic, right? Are there other visions of being Catholic that we need to be listening to? Because this is what happened in the history of slavery, right? The church used to be okay with slavery. It used to participate in it. But then at one point in history, the church adopted the theology of the abolitionist movement as its own, right? Through listening, through finally paying attention. So that, I think, is a place of hope for the future, of thinking, I'm really happy about Pope Francis doing this synodal process, because it means that there's going to be more listening. But the other thing too that I hoped for out of my own work, and that continue to hope for, is that, one of the things that child separation reminds us of is that, okay, so there was no legal relationship, in a way, between the parents and children, right? They could be separated, etc. What does that also mean? There wasn't inheritance passed down between parents and children, right? We know in American history and in economics that one of the biggest and most important ways of building wealth is generationally, through inheritances, right? But people weren't paid wages under slavery, right? That was stolen, right? That was stolen by their masters, which otherwise could have been passed down as an inheritance, right? So focusing on that child-parent relationship helps us to remember why today there's something like reparations needed, right? Because all of this wealth, all of those wages were stolen. And so it's my hope too that, focusing on this history will help us to see the need for restitution, something we call reparation today. Because when you look at that legal relationship, you see why in hundreds of years of not being able to pass down one's wages to one's children, there's so much inequity and inequality in the African diaspora today, because that money was stolen for years, for centuries. So that's another place of hope, that one day there will be a real reckoning with this and reparation.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to turn to Melisande in a second, but I just want to encourage anybody watching the webinar to ask a question through the Q&A portal. We're going to have some time in just a minute to field your questions and to dig deeper into the issues that you want to explore, you who are watching out there. So please send in your questions. Melisande, we'll finish this conversation about the legacies of the past and the present with you. And I am interested in going back to that clip, why you chose to tell the story of your family on the stage. What did you hope to accomplish through that act of storytelling?
Here I Am is an evolution and a work in progress still. That happened the first day I came to Georgetown's campus in 2017, first as a descendant, then as a student. And I realized that my coming to Georgetown was not to receive from Georgetown per se, but to bring my own family's history and story and inheritance back to the place and the people where it started. And that is here in Maryland with the Jesuits, their plantations, and Georgetown and all of the Jesuit schools, because up until a few years ago, descendants, families were left out of the Jesuit story of that human trafficking event in 1839. And we were all relegated to being dead by the Jesuits, some unfortunate plague that only wiped out the Maryland people. But we didn't die. And we have an unbroken 300-year relationship with the Society of Jesus and the United States of America that will be 250 years old, coming up soon. We are ancestors in the making. And I think we owe our descendants more truth, more authenticity, and more care about what we do, the intentions that we set. And I started this out by saying, today in America, we talk about child separation at the border, but we don't talk about child separation in America, the incarceral system that puts fathers in prison, mothers, over 600,000 women are incarcerated in America. We don't talk about the foster care system that turns out young people at 18 years old after grinding up their little souls to be homeless and unprepared onto our streets. We perpetuate a system that was created at the Constitution, codified by the 13th Amendment, and re-supported and shored up by the 1994 legislation that put children in jail. If we're not talking about that, yes, this is a global initiative, but we're here in America and we owe our descendants something better than what we have right now.
One, I would hope that paying attention to these issues in history, in excavating them, in bringing them to light when they've been suppressed or ignored, might open our eyes to some of the contemporary challenges of child family separation and trafficking that you identify, Melisande. So I think that's really important. And it reminds me that some of these key issues about child family separation they emerge in a new way with emancipation. So, for example, in the wake of emancipation in Maryland in 1864, Maryland passes basically a set of black codes that authorize the apprenticeship of black children to white families as a kind of guardianship in freedom. The assumption being that their black parents were not fit to be parents and couldn't take care of them properly. So they had to be basically legally farmed out to white families. That became a point of conflict in the era of emancipation and Reconstruction. So the issue of the separation of children from their parents like reemerges in the context of emancipation in a new way, shadowed, of course, by the whole history of slavery. So these things don't end in 1864 and 1865 with the abolition of chattel slavery. Let me give you one. Let me offer one other example. Perhaps we can talk about the persistence of this problem of the separation of children from families. And again, it comes from the historical record involving Georgetown. In 1824, Georgetown's first student, William Gaston, we have a big auditorium named after William Gaston, he actually gives a boy named Augustus to a Jesuit priest named Joseph Carberry to be educated and emancipated. And some years later, Carberry does in fact emancipate Augustus. So this seems like a benevolent and generous act to have Augustus educated and emancipated. But he's alone. So it's also an instance of a child being, you know, we don't know what his background was, but he's given to Carberry by himself. So we don't know who his family was. We don't know what his circumstances were. So it's just a really striking example of somebody being removed, presumably removed from their family in the name of freedom. It really strikes me, and I have a hard time with that document. So I want to ask you, you know, about the persistence of family separation after slavery, after emancipation. Like, where else do you see that today in the United States? Adrian, maybe I'll turn to you for that.
Sure. I think about how slavery went on for hundreds of years here in the United States. And then there was emancipation, which was maybe 5 minutes within an hour. And then we went through Jim Crow. And then we went through the civil rights era. And now we're in a time when they're rolling back civil rights things like affirmative action, the right to vote, redistricting, redlining. All these things are coming back. So in a way, it's trying to bring slavery back. And so you have a broken system of government where you get people put in prison for, you know, especially the 3 strikes, you're out. That was under Clinton, who some people finally say was the first Black president, and he wasn't. Prisons for children and poor people and anyone who can be discarded because they are thought of as less than. You have a broken system with education. You have a broken system with foster care. All these systems are broken and need to be fixed. And we're not doing anything about that. So as long as you continue to demonize people and treat them as less than, it's okay by some people, and it's not right. You know, not teaching the whole story in some states. You have Florida and Texas in particular, they're writing their own set of history. Oh, slavery wasn't that bad. At least some people learned a trade. No, it's not right to own another human being. It's not right to put people in prison and not give them the tools that they need if and when they get out. It's not right to take away someone's health care and then they become, especially if they have mental issues, they can't get their medication. So all these things are continuations of slavery, in my view.
Thank you, Adrian. We have a question from the audience. What strategies do we have for going forward with the church and with the government? You know, how do we address these issues today, informed by history? So what strategies do we have for going forward with the church and the government around these questions. Chris, maybe I'll turn to you on that. I know you've
Sure.
done some work in this respect.
Yeah, I'll speak mainly to the church aspect. Starting in the early 19th century, there was a false, well, really the late 18th century, there was a false narrative spread, and it became very, very popular that the church was always against slavery, like the Roman church was always against slavery. And this ended up even being in some papal documents. And so for this and for other reasons, including just simply the perpetuation of white supremacy, this history isn't well known today by a lot of people. And so I think that, especially in terms of what Adrian was saying, like, it's so important for us to know the history and to disseminate that history and get people to understand it. And that includes our bishops, our seminarians, right? Our parishes. And so, you can always, anybody on this call can go to can write a letter to the Catholic bishop of their diocese and say, hey, I just want to share some stories with you, some history. In the hope that, eventually we'll make it part of our official history, right? And so you can talk, you can write letters. And I think that is certainly one of the main strategies there. Of course, in the US we vote, right? We have that, it's different in the church. And so we really in the church have to talk through persuasion, and through educating. And so that's definitely been a big thing for me. I was in Rome this summer and met with some church officials, really wonderful people, and was able to talk to them about this history and say, we need to reckon with this as a church. And so I hope that kind of thing continues, because it's a history that we need to know.
Building on that answer, Chris, and I think this is a question for everyone, what is being taught in Catholic and Jesuit schools, especially secondary schools, around the history of slavery and post-slavery forms of racist discrimination? Can Catholic and Jesuit schools do more to teach this history? Can we teach it better? What's your sense of the work that we have to do on that level of education? And I actually include colleges as well. We've been trying to do this at Georgetown, teach this history in a really sustained and intentional way. But maybe we could do more.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of energy around in Jesuit high schools and universities to teach good, strong, true African American history. I think with the real problem, in my point of view, is that we have to get that same passion from leadership, right? Not just from teachers. We have to get our bishops to have that same passion, which I think a lot of them do, but not all. We have to get our priests to have that same passion, which a lot of them do, but not all. I have seen in archdioceses standards before for teaching children say that the Catholic Church was always against slavery and against the slave trade, right? And that's an injustice in itself to publish that kind of thing. So I think it's probably a mixed bag from place to place. There's going to be some Jesuit institutions or Catholic institutions that teach this stuff really well, that are really excited about it, that are passionate about it. And then there's going to be others where they aren't there, where the false narrative is being spread,
Adrian, I saw you nodding your head vigorously at one point when Chris was speaking. Have you seen energy in schools in Baltimore around teaching this history in a truthful and complete way? Do you think there's more to be done?
I think there's more to be done. There is a set of history books called, let's see, let me get it right, Black History 365. And our school's office loaned me the set of books, and they're grade specific. And I was telling our superintendent, these books need to be in every school in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, because it's written by educators who are African American, who've done a lot of research on this. And it shouldn't just be a Black History Month thing in February. It shouldn't just be a Black Catholic History Month in November. It has to be every day, 365. And so there's a lot to be said. I know as a child, I grew up in Chicago. I went to public school. And so our teachers made sure we had the knowledge. We had Black teachers. My parents happened to get us a set of Black encyclopedia. They told stories through oral traditions. And so that's important. And those are things that we need. If you go to other ethnic groups like Italians or Jews or whomever, they have family stories and they tell those stories. And so I think all of that is important. And it's important that we learn from all of us. Education is very important.
Sorry, I was muted myself. Speaking of family stories, I just want to bring up a question from the audience. And this is from my friend Rochelle Prater, who's a GU 272 descendant, who has a question. My 3 times great grandmother, Betty Ford West, was listed on the Articles of Agreement. However, she ran away with her kids, Augustine, 13 years old, and my second great grandmother, Delphi, 12 years old, were sent to Iberville Parish. Betsy's 2 younger kids, Christina, 11 years old, and Harriet Ann, only 4, were sent to Ascension Parish. Why do you think they separated the siblings? Michelle, thank you for that question. It raises an issue we haven't talked about, which is children being separated from each other. We've been talking a lot about parents and children, but what about siblings who are separated? And Chris, Melisande, Adrian, I don't know if you have an answer to Rochelle's question, but you might have a reflection on the phenomenon that she's talking about what happened to families in the context of the slave trade.
Sure. Every question about past practices of enslavement and in enslavement, human trafficking, all of that brings me to current questions. In America, when children go into foster care in America, siblings are often separated. And they are separated with no connection or knowledge of each other and where they are. What does that do? It breaks the bonds of personhood and belonging and being part of a connection and a family. And when you're picked apart and everybody's sent to a different place and you're a child, you grow up alone. And I think that's why. Why do we do it today? We do it today for the same reasons enslavers did it. To eat the souls of children.
Thank you, Melisande. There's a couple more questions in the Q&A, and we don't have that much more time, so I want to address them. The first, and this is probably one that Chris might be able to answer, what is the responsibility of religious superiors? Is there evidence of religious superiors objecting to church teaching and church leaders regarding slavery then?
Yeah. I think that the first thing to remember when we ask that question is that from very early on in its existence, there was in print documentation of the slave trade's atrocities. And so what does that mean? That means that to say, oh, people didn't know it was wrong back then is just completely false. It's a completely false narrative, right? Two, another thing to remember, there were priests every now and then who wrote theological treatises talking about why the slave trade was evil. Two of my favorites were these two Capuchin priests in the 1680s that were excommunicated by the Archbishop of Havana, Swarns and Jaca, right? They were incredible, and that so those arguments were all out there. And so religious superiors, if they had wanted to, could have made the choice that the Oblate sisters that Adrian was talking about with Mother Mary Lang made, which is that they chose not to participate in buying enslaved people. Now, at that time in Baltimore, I should mention, free people of color, if they wanted to, could hold people enslaved. But that order chose not to do that, right? So we do have an example of a religious order. They did the work themselves. You know, this is in two great books about that order and the work that they did on their own. And so Shannon D. Williams talks about this. And so, you know,
wonderful historian, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm forgetting the name right now of the emerita professor that she relies on as well for that history. But the point being, like, we have these examples of religious saying no. So there is then responsibility for moral responsibility of why did some religious superiors say yes, right? Why was there that valuing of economics over people, you know, when there were other examples of other ways to choose things? There were a couple Jesuits in the 1570s in Brazil who protested the enslavement of their community, of having enslaved people in their community in the 1570s. And it went all the way to Rome, to the Father Superior, Claudio Acquaviva, who made the decision to remove them from ministry. He sent a visitor down who removed them from ministry. And there was someone there that said, we have the letter, who wrote to the Father General and said, why not, you know, if people say, oh, we have to have enslaved people to keep our missions, then maybe we should have smaller missions, right? But the society at that time chose to reject that and move forward. And so we know that there's culpability, you know, and we know there's responsibility there.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, there was one lesson in the history that there was always another way. There are always alternatives. There are always paths not taken and voices articulating those possibilities. I think that's important to remember. We're almost out of time. There was a question about how people who are uncomfortable talking about this history can talk about it. There are people who are uncomfortable with this history. How do we have healthy, constructive conversations with those folks around it? But I don't know if we have time to answer that question, but it is one that hovers over a lot of conversations that we have over these difficult histories, including the history of slavery. But I want to thank our panelists, Adrian, Melisande, and Chris, for a wonderful conversation. I hope those of you who were watching got something valuable out of it. Gillian, do you want to drop back in and close us out?
Thank you. I had to unmute and unhide myself. Thank you so much. This was really so informative, and I especially appreciate this history from long ago to the current day and what it means in our current lives. This collaborative forum is actually open. We are inviting everyone to participate. If you would like to share a blog or an audio recording or a video, we've shared the submission guidelines in the chat, and we hope that this will be a living conversation that can inspire people around the world. We're also talking about some of the subjects that were mentioned earlier in the conversation, including the history of child-family separation in Native American boarding schools, another piece of Catholic history and American history that deserves more attention. And then we'll be speaking about the Catholic Church's response to child-family separation in migration policy in response, which is in many ways a hopeful example, right? Where the church was actually doing quite a bit to ensure that families could stay together in recent cases in migration. And then we'll be looking at the path forward, reckoning with this history and what does it really mean for the church as we consider our duties to children and to families as people of faith. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Adam, for moderating this conversation. Thank you to everyone for participating, and to be continued. Thanks.